remember hearing about Paul, who a lot of people know I don't like Paul. And but you know what? Doing this study, I think I've come to understand him a bit more, and I don't dislike him as much as I used to. So it's been quite interesting because I realised that he's had a really difficult time, which I think shows up in Philippians. Now, I'll just give you a little bit, like we had a bit of background how we got into where he is now. He's in Rome, under house arrest, and he's had a hard time getting there by being persecuted by a lot of people. And you saw he had a shipwreck. It was very hard for him to get to Rome, but God said he was going to go to Rome, and he's there now. And he writes back to his friends in the Philippian church. Now, actually, Philippi, the country where the Philippians were, or the city, is quite interesting. It was founded in 356 before Christ by the Macedonian King Philip II. He was the father of Alexander the Great. How's that? And the city was very valuable. He made it a city because it had silver and gold mines, and he used the money from that for his battles. It was developed as a small Rome once the Roman Empire was established, and it was in a really good spot because it was on the trading route between Europe and Asia. So all the travellers went that way, and then when Paul made the church there and people became Christians, they would travel and take the message out. So it's really interesting, isn't it, where God puts different churches. It was very strategic. Now, Paul was very close to this group of believers because they supported him many times. Remember last week we found out that Epaphroditus was sent there with a gift of money, and so Paul had a soft spot in his heart for them. Now he has a talk. You saw in the Bible reading, he calls them like dogs. A group that's in there, barking dogs with more of a bark than a bite. He has a go at these people. Now this gave me the clue about what was going on. They were Jews. Now they had decided to follow Jesus, but they felt that to follow Jesus, you had to become a Jew first. They saw following Jesus as part of Judaism. And it makes perfect sense. Jesus was a Jew. He lived a Jewish life. The only Bible Jesus ever read was what we call the Old Testament. He worshipped God in the synagogue and kept the feast days as set out in Jewish tradition. He knew his scriptures very well, so well. Remember when he was about 12, he was in the temple with the leaders who were amazed at his knowledge. Now, the early church were trying to work out what it meant to be a follower of Jesus in the world that they were living in. They were encountering opposition from the Romans and from the Jewish leaders themselves, who had hounded Jesus too. So when you think about it, it's always difficult, isn't it, to work out your faith in the context that you live in. And it's even harder to bring the gospel to people who live in a different culture. Paul had brought these Jewish teachings into the Greek world, to people who were not Jews. They were called Gentiles. They were Greeks and that. So when you think about it, he had a hard time, didn't he? Trying to explain what it was to be a follower of Jesus and not also be a Jew, because it was a Jewish culture, wasn't it, that it was coming out of. And you know what? I thought, yeah, that makes sense to me. I think I would have decided to be a Jew to follow Jesus because he was a Jew. And I thought, I can imagine how difficult it would have been. Imagine bringing the gospel to a completely different culture and time. And this fits in with our mission spot before. Dawn was talking about how difficult it was for missionaries to go out to a different culture. And I had a look on good old Google and I found two different approaches to missions. There was a lady called Narcissa Prentice. Now this is back in 1808. She was the eldest of 9 children, born in New York. Her mother was an over-the-top religious Presbyterian, and the children were totally under her thumb. Narcissa was converted at the age of 11, and by age 15 she was committed to becoming a missionary. Narcissa had no contact with any other people of different culture or racial backgrounds. She lived a cultivated and organised life in refined society, but she wanted to bring the gospel to the Cayuse Indians, who were semi-nomadic hunters and horsemen. Now have a listen to this. They had little use for homes, spent much time on horseback, and they traded furs with the Hudson Bay Company. They were everything Narcissa abhorred. They were dirty, they were polygamous, they were alcohol drinkers, they were gamblers, and they had dark skins and painted their faces and lived communally. When Narcissa travelled to where they were, she's actually quite revered in Washington because she was the first white woman who made the trip there, and that's what she's famous for. But when she went there with her husband, she refused them at the Indians access to her home. This was what she wrote in her diary. I didn't want the dirty heathen in my private space. And while the Indians didn't have any concept of privacy, everything was shared for them and no place was off limits. Narcissa and her husband confused faith and culture. The Indians were worried about the changes to their culture, but the missionaries saw their nomadic life as a barrier to their conversion and wanted them to become farmers and settle and become Christian. See, they had it back to front, didn't they? It was very, very hard, and it eventually was impossible. And even though they were there for 10 years, there was not one convert, and they were eventually killed by the Indians themselves. So her heart was in the right place, wasn't it? She wanted the best. She wanted these people to know about Jesus, but she didn't know how to do it. She went about it the wrong way. Now, in comparison, you might have heard of Hudson Taylor. About the same period of time, 1853, he sailed to China and landed in Shanghai. From the beginning, he felt compelled to immerse himself in the culture, in their language. He learnt their language and their traditions. Unlike many missionaries who clung to Western customs, he adapted. He walked around in Chinese dress, he learned the language and sought to live among the people he served. It's even a different language altogether, isn't it? He went there to serve them. This was very unconventional and a very bold approach at the time, as many missionaries struggled with giving up the Western way of life, even though they wanted to bring the gospel. Hudson Taylor was the most widely used missionary in Chinese history. He was there for 51 years, and his mission established 20 mission stations. They brought 849 missionaries to the field. They trained 700 Chinese workers, raised $4 million by faith, and developed a witnessing Chinese church of 125,000 people. And it has been said that he actually baptized some 50,000 people. What a difference, hey? What a difference. Paul, in this passage that we heard about, talks about traditions that people cling to. He says they're not important. The important thing, the most important thing, is to know Jesus, the crux of Jesus' teachings, not the other things that we surround ourselves. And we do it too, don't we? We sometimes hang on to our traditions and think they're very, very important. But in the reading, Paul says the things that the group were clinging to, he had also experienced them, but he was willing to give them away. To know Jesus was everything. You might have heard the reading. I'm just going to read a little part of what he said. Like he was saying, I know what you're doing. I know you're trying to convert the people to Judaism first, so then they can be followers. And he says, but you know what? I was there too. This is what Paul says. If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. I was circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews in regard to law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, I was faultless, he says. So he's saying, I've done all these things. I've done them all. But he says, there's more. Following Jesus is the most important. And I thought, I imposed my thing on this. So I'm reading like Paul. I'm pretending to be Paul. Okay, I was baptised at Murrumbina Baptist in the Baptist Church. I've been a Christian since I was 13 years old. I completed my Bachelor of Theology at Whitley College. I always adhered to the traditions of the church. You might resonate with some of these. I didn't go shopping on Sundays, or the movies, or I didn't wear makeup, or smoked, or drank. I didn't even go to a drive-in until I met Ray. I wore a hat to church on Sundays. Yeah, you resonate with that, ladies? And gloves. And I was always modest in my dress until the mini skirt became fashionable. And yet, I must admit, I agree with Paul, who says none of that matters. He counts it all as trash. Isn't that amazing? He says trying to adhere to rules shows us up as being weak because we fail, don't we? The law is there and we fail it. We know we're failures. Our only righteousness, as our song said and as our Bible reading said, comes from trusting Jesus, because then we are given God's righteousness. Knowing Jesus personally is all that matters. Sharing the good news of Jesus with all who will listen is all that counts. Go all the way with Jesus. Paul says to be prepared to suffer with him and all the way to death itself. Paul didn't just talk about it, he actually went through with it. He was persecuted and imprisoned only because he stood up for Jesus. It led, and you know what? Only a couple of years after he writes this letter to the Philippians, he was executed because of his stand. In the same way, Jesus and his followers will find themselves on the wrong side of society, especially today, it appears. We need to look at Jesus and stick close to him, obeying him, following his example, and letting the Holy Spirit be the guide in our lives. Let the rules that are around be our guide, not our master. Just imagine if we adhered to all the rules that have been written down for us to obey. Not just in the church, but outside. Let's have a look at some of them and see. Do you know, I looked up some laws in Australia today. You can be jailed for up to, and they're still in the books and you can still be charged. You can be jailed for up to 1 year for cleaning up seabird poo or bat poo without a licence in Western Australia. And you can be also fined thousands of dollars for possessing more than 50 grams of potatoes in Western Australia. It's still in the law books. There you go, be careful. And New South Wales drivers who do not take enough care to avoid splashing passengers on mud on the public bus can be fined up to $2,000. Be careful if you're driving around in New South Wales. And you know what? You can go to jail for 10 years if you correspond or do business with pirates. That's section 70C in the Crimes Act in Victoria. And it's also, ladies, take note of this, it's also an offence in Victoria to make unreasonable noise with a vacuum cleaner after 10 p.m. at night or before 7 a.m. on weekdays and 9 a.m. on weekends. It's still there. And you know what? That law started in 1970. It's not even that old. The noise will be considered unreasonable if it can be heard by your next door neighbours in any room in their house, whether the door is open or closed. And the police, watch out, Yarra Council, police or the council, you know what our council's like, can direct you to stop making the noise for 72 hours. And if you don't listen, you can be fined, guess what? $18,000. Good laws, aren't they? I hope you're listening. You know, if Jesus were here today, he would be wanted by the Liquor Licensing Board for turning water into wine without a licence, the Australian Medical Association for practising medicine without a licence, the Health Department for feeding 5,000 people in the open air, the Education Department for teaching without a certificate. See, the Blossom agrees with me. The Water Police for walking on water without a life jacket, the RSPCA for driving a herd of pigs into the sea, the Australian Board of Psychiatrists for giving free advice on living a guilt-free life. I implore you, along with Paul, to not let the church fall into the trap of seeing traditions and rules as being more important than people. Makes us think, doesn't it? And I said to Ray, how come I got this message today when we're having our annual general meeting after church? And I said to him, hang on a minute, where does it say in the Bible that we have to have a constitution? But it's actually the government. Because of our money, we collect money and we want the GST and all that stuff. So I'm just telling you. Tradition has it that Michelangelo was teaching some art students one day. He walks over to one of his students and then starts painting on the canvas. He then hands the student the brush. The student, as you can imagine, is awestruck. He asks, how can I finish what you have started? And Michelangelo said, let this inspire you to finish what I have started. In much the same way, this is the challenge that Jesus has left with us. We need to be inspired by the great work that Jesus started in this world and then add to it with love and devotion to bringing people into God's kingdom. So feel free to follow Jesus because he has freed us and blessed us to follow him. So do it in a free way. Amen.